line that you see up there, Genesis chapter 2, that selection from Genesis 2 and the selection from Genesis 3. We looked at those passages last week. And ultimately, this is what we can see from observing the flesh of man. You can turn with me if you'd like. I'm going to be reading from Ecclesiastes Chapter 3, verses 18 through 21. This is a synopsis of what we can observe by looking at the flesh of man. I said in my heart, with regard to the children of man, that God is testing them, that they may see that they themselves are but beasts. For what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beast is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beast, for all is vanity. All go to one place, all are from the dust, and to dust all returns. Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of the beast goes down to the earth? That, of course, is examining and looking at things from a purely materialistic perspective. If we don't do anything more than look at the body of a man, look at this flesh as it's animated in life, look at what happens to it when it dies, and compare it to what we see with the rest of the beast of this earth, we see no difference. We see a dog, and we have a pet dog, and it lives for a few years, and it dies, and we bury it, and it returns to the dust. And that's what happens to man as well. How do we know that there's anything different about man? How do we know that the spirit of man goes upward? Or do we know that the spirit of man goes upward? I'm sorry? Okay, God tells us. That's the only way we know. And we have to understand that there's not really any way, in the language of our modern time, there's not really any way scientifically, through observation, to know about the distinction of man. We read about that in the Genesis account, though. Let us make man in our image, in our likeness. He formed man of the dust of the ground. He breathed life into man. But then we see in Genesis 3 that something else happened, right? That there's a moral weight. That there is a concept of right and wrong with mankind. Do beasts recognize good and evil? So I'm going to tell you real quick. Your favorite pet, especially if it's a dog, will take the steak off of your plate in a second and not feel the least bit guilty about anything. Why? Because there's a difference between us and the beasts of the field. But as we just read in Ecclesiastes 3, if you're looking at it from a purely material standpoint, we don't have any way of knowing that. We have to read Genesis 3 and see where man came to the awareness of good and evil, and that after he became of the awareness of good and evil, man did what? Hid in shame, recognizing that they had done wrong. That's where we get that from. Now, while that is true and that is the case, go back to verse 11 of Ecclesiastes 3 and you read this. Speaking of God, He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. And so there is this principle that we are inherently aware that there's something greater than what we can see, right? Eternity is set in the heart of man. We're aware that there's something beyond our existence in time. But we can't find it out on our own. That's what it says. He's made everything beautiful in His time. Also, He's put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. We can't search and find those answers on our own. The only way that we have that information is from the revelation, from what God has made known. So we learn that man's more than flesh, and we learn that man is moral, that he's a spiritual being, that he needs to know good and evil, at least if we hope to do what's right, we need to know good and evil. And we saw this in Genesis at the revelation about the creation of man. We've talked about this before, but I'll mention it once again just for the benefit of those online who may not have heard it before, or our visitors this morning that may not have heard it before. Listen, God doesn't record every single thing that He did at creation. How long do you think the book would be if He actually recorded every single act, every intention, every thought, every event that took place in the creation of the universe? We can't even count the stars. How long would the book be if He said, okay, then I created this one, and then I created this one, and then I created... This one came into being, and it was this size, and it was this way, and it's exactly this far from the earth. And if we had all of that kind of detail, we couldn't read. And so creation's basically set forth in 28 verses. Relatively short verses. Relatively simple verses. So we're not given every detail, but we're given the information that's necessary for us to do what? For us to understand the nature of man and our relationship to God, and the fact that we sustain a unique relationship to God. There's a couple of people in the room I know that have pets. Why didn't we bring our pets to services with us this morning? Why didn't we bring our pets to services with us this morning? They wouldn't understand, and they don't need it. They don't have an eternal soul that extends beyond this life. They don't have the rationality to comprehend and to make moral choices like we do. They don't gain benefit. And we know that because of what's revealed, not because of what we see. It's important for us to realize that all of this explains us and our relationship to God and our standing and why any of the rest of it matters. Why do I care that someone named Jesus lived in Nazareth 2,000 years ago? Why do I care? I never met him. I'm never going to meet him on this earth. I'm sorry? We do know about him. I hope to. But the only reason I hope to meet him is because I understand. I understand why he matters. Listen, isn't that where Paul started when he started preaching on Mars Hill in Athens? Explaining to his audience why any of it mattered. Explaining that God created all things. And that in Him we live and move and have our very being. And so because of that it matters. The rest of it matters. This is absolutely fundamental to understanding my position in this world, my relationship to God, and how I should live my life. If I don't get this, I don't get any of it. And so, Adam and the things that happened with Adam and Eve are extremely important. Now, recall particularly what we read about in chapter 3. What did we read about in chapter 3? It is colloquially referred to as the fall. I don't really like that language, but in Genesis 3 we read about Satan. We find out about our adversary. We find out about his propensity to do what? To lie to us and deceive us. To get us to do things contrary to the will of God. And we saw that man, in fact, does fall prey to temptation and make such choices, and we saw what the effect of that is. Where these two had once communed freely with God, been comfortable with Him, spoke to Him, interacted with Him, they now run and hide from Him. That's what sin does. It creates enmity between us and God. And so let's look at what Hosea says in Hosea 6, verses 4 through 7. Now, there are other places that we could look, but this is representative of how those events are used to explain things. Hosea is, in this chapter, talking about Israel and Judah. He's talking about their unrepentant attitudes. What shall I do with you, Ephraim? What shall I do with you, O Judah? So Ephraim represents the northern tribes of Israel. Judah represents the 2.5 tribes that made up the southern kingdom. And he's saying, what am I going to do with you guys? You ever said that to your children? I just don't know what I'm going to do with you. That's exactly what God's doing. Frustrated with their choices, frustrated with the way that they're living, frustrated with what they're doing. He says, what shall I do with you? Your love is like a morning cloud, like the dew that goes away early. You know those morning clouds that are just there for a little while, and then you look back a few minutes later and the sky's blue? You know, there were clouds here earlier. Are the dew? It just disappears? Unless you live in South Louisiana, and then it hangs around until about noon, but that's another story. Therefore I have hewn them by the prophets. I have slain them by the words of my mouth. So he sent prophets to them to metaphorically slay them through his words. I've slain them by the words of my mouth, and my judgment goes forth as the light. For I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, for the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. But like Adam, they transgressed the covenant. There they dealt faithlessly with me. You hear that? Israel and Judah's sin was just like Adam's. What they did was just like what Adam did. And guess what that means? When we sin, we're just like Adam. When we sin, we're just like Judah. We're just like Israel. We read these things in the Bible, and we tend to do what toward these people? Yeah, it's okay, you can say it. We're hard on them, aren't we? How could they do that? How could they forget what God did for them? How could they not trust God? How could they do what they clearly knew they were not supposed to do? Satan says, God said you can't eat any of this fruit. Eve says, no, that's not what God said. God said we could eat any of the fruit except from this one tree. That tree, he said, don't eat of. That tree, he said, in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. She didn't lack understanding of what God had said, and yet she went ahead and ate the fruit anyway, right? We're just like that. In the New Testament, in one place, we're told that Eve was deceived, but Adam was not. And so that means when Adam wanders along and Eve gives him the fruit, he wasn't even buffaloed by what was said the way that Eve was. He went into it with his eyes wide open. He knew exactly what he was doing and that it was wrong, and he did it anyway. When we sin, ultimately we're doing the same thing. We're either deceived or we willfully choose to sin. That's what we learn in Genesis 3. That's why the story of Adam's recorded. The information. How many years did Adam live? Anybody remember? I want to say it's 926, but I may be wrong about it. It's 900 and something. It may be a few years short of that. I don't recall. Those lists get long that have all those years. I think it's around chapter 4 that we learned that. But the point is this, he lived for 900 years and his entire life is synopsized in less than 1,000 words. We don't get a picture of every single thing that Adam did. We don't even know all of their children, do we? I love the way it goes through that list. These are the generations of Adam. There's Cain, and there's Abel, and there's Seth, and he had other sons and daughters. What about those other sons and daughters? Why don't we learn about them? Because they're not part of the story that's teaching us about ourselves. So when we read this stuff, we have to look at it that way. What is this telling me about my position in this world? What is this telling me about my life? What does this mean for my relationship with God? How quickly can we go from small sins to gross sins that everyone recognizes as sinful? Well, you just look at chapter 4 and the story of Cain. Adam and Eve ate some fruit. Cain murdered his brother. That's how quick we can get there. Who had Cain ever seen murder anyone? Where did he get the idea from? You know, we have a school of thought that suggests that the reason why bad people are bad is because of what they were taught and what they saw as children. That it's nurture. That's why they act that way. Okay, what explains the murder of Abel? And by the way, it wasn't nature either, was it? He wasn't just born that way. So what explains it? He was jealous. That's what jealousy does to us. You want to know where it'll take you? That's where it'll take you. Not just to saying mean things about someone. Not just shooting the enemy on the battlefield. But plotting to murder your own flesh and blood. That's where jealousy will take you. Jealousy will divide families. It will destroy relationships. It will get in between man and God. It will get in between man and man. You ever felt jealous in your life? What you read about in the story of Cain and Abel is why you need to be worried about that. And Hosea is here using Adam and saying, look, you guys are acting just like they did. Now, the people that read or heard Hosea's preaching when he was sent can now go back and read the story of Adam and go, oh, that's what we're doing. Because they've been made aware. It's just like David, right? Anybody remember the story of David? 2 Samuel 11. Bathsheba. Did he not know he was doing something wrong? I mean, let's be real. Hey, she is somebody. I mean, we won't even talk about the fact that David was already married. We're just going to control that for a minute. Go find out about her. I'm interested in her. Servants come back and say, well, she's married. Did David not know that it was wrong? Yeah, he was familiar with the law. What he did is the same thing that every one of us do when we find ourselves in that situation. We justify in our own minds why it doesn't apply to us, why this is different. Why in these circumstances, at this time, and because it involves me and what I want to do, that it's okay for me to do it. And he believed that all the way up until the point that Nathan did what? that Nathan brought him face to face with his sin. How did he do that, by the way? By telling him a story about sheep. He says, hey, you know what? You got this rich guy who's got all these flocks of sheep, and you got this one poor guy over here who's got one little lamb. That's all he has. And this rich guy with all of these sheep looks down and says, hey, I like that little lamb. I'm going to take it for myself. And he takes that lamb. And David said, well, that's just terrible. David understood it because David was a shepherd, and David understood what it meant to have your livestock stolen from you. And he says, that's awful. Such a man deserves to die. And then he came face to face with what? Wait a minute. That's about what I did with Bathsheba. When Nathan said, you're the man. You're the person that I'm talking about. This is just like what you did. You have to understand that these things are explaining what we do. When we read about their sin, and we think to ourselves, how awful, how could someone do something so terrible? We're talking about ourselves. Our sin's the same thing. They're not any worse than we are. And we're not any better than they are. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Read that somewhere. There is none who is righteous. No, not one. Read that somewhere too. So we shouldn't read the story of Adam and Eve and think, how foolish is that? They knew and they did it anyway? How dumb is that? Look, all I'm doing is condemning myself. Because I do that all the time. And Romans 1 makes it clear that if I don't know better, I'm still without excuse. Because what? Because it's evident. And the information is all around us, and it is there, and eternity is set in our hearts, so that we ought to be curious creatures who are trying to understand what makes us different and why we should care. Does a pack of wild dogs have a Congress that passes laws about how they should behave? No, but humans do. Why do we have... Listen, every collection of humans, I don't care how big or how small it is. You look at the world, we've created what? The UN. And created what we call a body of international law that says this is what countries ought to do. This is how countries ought to behave. You get inside of a nation, and our nation has its Congress to make such laws, and its executive branch to exercise those laws, and its judicial branch to determine whether or not those laws are actually being executed or not. You get into a state, same thing. You get into a city, the same thing. Your homeowners association, same thing. Inside this neighborhood, these are the rules we're going to create. This is the behavior we're going to accept and the behavior we're not going to accept. Why do human beings do that? You can get down even smaller than that. Classrooms. Classrooms have rules. Even in formal settings, we don't have a formal set of rules posted anywhere, but what are we not doing? Well, we're not talking over one another. If someone has something they'd like to say, they indicate their interest in speaking, and they're recognized, and the floor is given to them. We're not following Robert's Rules of Order. We just do that. Why? Because those are the understood practices of proper decorum. Why are humans like that? Because we are different, because we're created in the image of God, because we're eternal, because we exist beyond physical life. And all these things are teaching us why it matters. Look with me at 1 Corinthians 15. We're going to make some more specific applications of what we learned in Adam. Now, I want to tell you at the outset that the entire chapter of 1 Corinthians 15 is about the resurrection of the body. About the fact that even though our bodies die, and even though they go to the earth and they return to dust, that they're not going to be left there. And that the fact that Christ was raised is the proof that we're all going to be raised. Because if Jesus was like us in every point, which the Bible affirms that he was a man like we are, which the Bible affirms that he was, and he died and he was raised, then we should believe that we too will be raised. That's the argument that's being set forth in this entire. And what was happening is apparently some in Corinth were saying that there was no resurrection. And he says if there's no resurrection, then the gospel is void. It's empty. It's at the very core of the gospel that man is different than the beasts. And if we are not raised, then preaching is vain, the gospel is vain, we have no hope. And religious people are the most pitiable people of all because they're scrambling around trying to understand all this stuff to no reason. If we have hoped in this life only, we are of all men to be most pitied. That's what he wrote. So there has to be an awareness of that. And in the course of that discussion, we're going to start reading in verse 35. But someone will ask, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body do they come? I believe that actually those are two good questions. I don't think that the text is suggesting that these are improper questions in any way. You foolish person. This is a statement not about the questions, but a statement about it ought to be apparent to you. What you sow does not come back to life unless it dies. And what you sow is not the body that is to be, but a bare kernel, perhaps of wheat or some other grain. And so again, he's turning to the processes of life itself, the things that we do observe in nature, to say, you know what, you really ought to understand that when we're talking about a resurrected body, we're not saying that it's not changed. You remember the question? With what kind of body do they come? How are we raised? He said, well, think about putting a wheat kernel in the ground. What comes out of the ground when you bury that wheat kernel? A plant. Something that I might suggest is even more glorious than what was planted, correct? You plant a seed, and then you get this living, flowering, fruit-producing thing from it, something greater than what was put in the ground. God gives it a body as he has chosen, and to each kind of seed its own body. The reason why it happens, and the reason why corn produces corn, and wheat produces wheat, and apple seeds produce apple trees, and acorns produce oak trees, is because that's the way God designed it and set it up. And so he's saying the same is true for us. Not all flesh is the same, but there's one kind for humans, and another for animals, and another for birds, and another for fish. There are heavenly bodies and earthly bodies, but the glory of the heavenly is of one kind, and the glory of the earthly is of another. In other words, it's going to be that we're not going to have an earthly body anymore. The glory is different. There's one glory of the sun, another glory of the moon, another glory of the stars. For star differs from star in glory. So it is with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown is perishable. This fleshly body it rots, it spoils, it goes bad, it gets sick and diseased and weak and tired. So it is with the resurrection of death. What is sown is perishable. What is raised is imperishable. It's sown in dishonor. It's raised in glory. Death. It's sown in death, right? That's when we bury the body. When it's died. It's sown in dishonor. It's raised in glory. It's sown in weakness. It's raised in power. It's sown a natural body, it's raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. If this body exists, and clearly it does, I'm in it, using it, touching it. He says if there is a natural body, then there also is just as certain a spiritual body. Thus it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. That is a quote from Genesis. Paraphrase. Man breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. The first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. That's really important. Who is this last Adam? Jesus. And so Adam stands as a shadow or a type of Jesus. And in this case, it's kind of an antitype, right? Adam's like the fleshly body, the weakened body, and Jesus is like the imperishable body, the spiritual body. The first Adam became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. But it's not the spiritual that is first, but the natural, and then the spiritual. The first man was from the earth, a man of dust. We read about that, right? God formed Adam from the dust of the ground. The second man is from heaven. As was the man of dust, so also are those who are of the dust. That's you and me and everybody else. And as is the man of heaven, so also are those who are of heaven. That is, those of us who become sons of God through Christ. Just as we have borne the image of the man of dust, we shall also bear the image of the man of heaven. This is his argument for how we know that there is a resurrection and why we can hope in that resurrection. When I'm raised, I will not be limited the way that I am today. This perishable body will put on imperishable. This corrupted body will be raised incorruptible. It will be like him. This natural body that belongs to the earth will be raised as something that belongs to the heavens. So it's sown in dishonor, but it's raised in glory. And so Jesus is the substance, the spiritual substance of what Adam is materially. By the way, what do we learn about Adam and Eve? Why was Eve called Eve? Anybody remember that? I don't think we read it, but it's there in the text. You've read it before. Because she was the mother of all the living. You realize what that means, right? You and me. directly traceable back to Adam and Eve. This fleshly body is a procreation from that. God created, and on the sixth day, He finished His creation, and He ceased from His work creating. He stopped creating at that point. Everything that has come up after Adam and Eve has been a continuation of that event. This natural body goes all the way back to God forming Adam of the dust of the ground and Eve out of the rib of Adam, and their procreation, their continuing that creation. Yes. This But there's something else we got to keep in mind. You're getting in some really, really difficult to navigate waters. That's the first thing I want to say. That resurrected Jesus did, in fact, still bear the scars of His crucifixion. Thomas was able to actually touch Him and find the holes and put his hand in His side. He was able to eat fish. But you're right, at times His own disciples didn't recognize Him. I can't completely grasp and understand what all that means about the nature of His body, but this is what I do know. It was the one that had lived on the earth and been persecuted and put on the cross. We know that because of Thomas's interaction with Him after the resurrection. It was that body, but it was changed and fit because it ascended into heaven. And flesh and blood doesn't inherit heaven. And we also know that the angel at His ascension told His disciples, who were completely in awe of what they were witnessing, why do you stand here gazing into the heavens? This same Jesus whom you see ascending will return. It did not. Right. Yeah. With angels, you bring up another interesting story. Now, there is a sense in where we're told we're going to be like the angels. That's another issue. But I will say about angels, obviously, for instance, Abraham saw those two angels, interacted with those two angels, fed them. Who came to him before Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed? In another place, though, Balaam's riding on a donkey. Balaam sees nothing. But the donkey sees something. And he begins to beat on the donkey. So it's really something that is not able to be pigeonholed, because sometimes they could be seen and sometimes they could not. Sometimes Jesus was recognized, sometimes He wasn't. There's a lot made out of the fact that the door was locked, but Jesus entered into the room. That's not normal for a physical body, is it? If all the doors are locked and I try to get in, I'm just locked out. And yet Jesus was able to apparently pass through and enter the room despite the fact that the door was locked after his resurrection when he appeared to his disciples. And so there are some things about it that we're not given all the information about how it happened and exactly what his body was. We are told that there is a point in time when we will see and understand him for what he is. And that is when we are changed and we're going to see him, for we will be like him. So the point is that everything that Adam was and that he stands for in terms of our fleshly existence, and we can look back at him and say, well, I'm just like that. His body was formed out of the dust of the ground, so I know that my body is what? Dust. He sinned and separated himself from God, so I know that I am weak and sinful. I can fall prey to such things. He died. I'm going to die. He was buried. Hopefully I'll be buried. Yes, ma'am. Yep. Love that verse. That's right.
So we don't have to worry about a lot of this stuff.
What that verse tells me, coupled with what we're told in, I think it's 1 Peter, that God has made known to us all things that pertain to life and godliness, is that grasping and understanding those aspects of the nature of his body don't have anything to do with life and godliness.
It's something to discuss.
It is.
Think about, but we don't have to really worry about it. God will take care of it.
Mainly we need to discuss it so we don't fall into the pit that so many of us fall into when it's an area that there isn't any information. We speculate and try to fill in the blanks. Is that a good idea for me to speculate and try to fill in the blanks? No, because I'm really poor at doing that. And so we have to think about all of those things. We're not going to have time, because we're out of time already, to get into Romans 5. But we're going to be looking at the other side of this Adam coin in Romans 5. Romans 5 is dealing with deliverance from sin and death, and Adam comes into that discussion as well. So we've got the resurrection of the body in 1 Corinthians 15, that Adam becomes a symbol for us, and deliverance from sin and death, Adam's going to become a symbol for us as well. And we'll talk about that, Lord willing, next time. Thank you for all of your presence and your participation, and thanks for the guys that have been watching online or that will watch this video later today.